There's a trend right now toward flattening in organizations, and we see that in our data. You can flatten organizations, have larger spans of control, but if you don't do it with the right conditions, like the ones we've been talking about, it's going to lead to failure. And so while organizations want to do more flattening, get rid of middle managers and expand the span of each manager, if you just do that structurally and you don't put the right conditions in place, like engaging your team makes a difference. Knowing how much individual contributor work each manager does and how many people they can actually manage relative to that. The big one we've been talking about is having the habit of weekly conversations with people. So if you ignore those conditions and you just expand the span, you're setting yourself up for failure.
Welcome to Leadership, the podcast where leadership meets real-world insights. In each episode, you can eavesdrop on exclusive conversations with top thought leaders, best-selling authors, and experts in leadership, communication, relationships, culture, and everything else that shapes your effectiveness in the workplace and in your personal life. Leadership is here for you. Now, here's our host, himself a seasoned coach and best-selling author, Dr. Rodger Dean Duncan.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Leadership, the podcast where we explore the mindset, skills, and behaviors that help you succeed in every relationship in your life, especially those in which people look to you for leadership. Here's a question worth pondering. What if the biggest threat to your organization's performance is not your competition, your technology debt, or your supply chain? What if it's the quiet disengagement of the people sitting in your meetings, answering your emails, and serving your customers every single day? Dr. Jim Harter has spent more than 30 years at Gallup studying exactly that threat, measuring it, quantifying it, and documenting what the best leaders and organizations do to reverse it. As Gallup's chief scientist of workplace management and well-being, Jim has overseen research involving millions of employees across hundreds of organizations worldwide. He's co-author of Culture Shock, An Unstoppable Force is Changing How We Work and Live. It's a book that examines the seismic shifts reshaping how people relate to their work and what leaders must do to respond. In the conversation ahead, we'll explore the hard data on engagement and performance, the real causes of burnout, the leadership behaviors that make or break a team's culture, and what the rise of AI means for the human side of work. If you lead people at any level, this episode is for you. Dr. Jim Harter, welcome to Leadership.
Thanks, Roger. Great to be with you today.
Now, Gallup's research spans decades and thousands of organizations. What's the single most counterintuitive finding about employee engagement that many executives still seem to refuse to believe?
Well, Roger, the reason I would call this counterintuitive is it's just not practiced. So maybe it sounds common sense, but it doesn't get followed, and that's how people pick who the manager is. And organizations, in many cases, pick managers for what seems like the right reasons. They're a good individual contributor, or they stayed with the company for a long time, but they get into the job and they don't have the natural ability or the skills to do the job effectively. And so we've found that 70% of the variance in team engagement comes right back to the manager, how the manager practices their job on a daily basis, and how organizations select who that next manager is in each role is critical.
And that can go back to the manager's manager. They didn't have good modeling.
Right. Yeah. It really is managers at all levels. Now, there's some organizations that are really good at practicing this, but if you look at the aggregate of organizations around the world, they're really bad at it. And it really slows down their momentum in terms of building a culture.
When leaders push back and say engagement is a soft metric, what hard data do you put in front of them?
Well, we've conducted 11 iterations of meta-analysis, which is an analysis of many studies. Our current meta-analysis includes 180,000 business units. We study outcomes like profitability, productivity, customer service, whether people stay or leave the organization, absenteeism, numerous outcomes, including employee well-being. So we look at hard outcomes, and we've done that for decades, actually. We've published a number of these studies in academic peer-reviewed journals. There is a strong connection between how engaged people are and their performance if you measure engagement the right way, right? It's not happiness.
Right.
Engaged people do tend to be happier, but, we're measuring tangible business-related elements like role clarity and do people have what they need to do their work? Do they get recognized when they do good work? Do they have a chance to do what they do best?
So they need more than ping pong tables in the employee cafeteria.
Yeah, that might keep them happy for a little while, but again, that's not going to make them more productive necessarily. It might connect them with their colleagues a little bit more. I'm not saying perks are bad, but if you're trying to build a culture just on perks alone, you're kind of feeding the bears. They'll keep coming back, but eventually it's going to wear off and they're going to look for something that's more fulfilling than that.
Your research shows that most employees, sadly, are not engaged, and that's been true for decades. Why haven't more organizations treated it as the crisis that it appears to be?
Organizations that I've seen are measuring engagement in some way. But to be real frank with you, Rodger, there's some poor measurement out there. I'm not saying there's poor questions being asked, but how they quantify engagement in many cases ends up being a measure of contentment. So to give you an example, let's say that you're measuring engagement by asking people some questions on a 1 to 5 point scale, and you're combining the 4s and 5s together. That's a measure of contentment. If you bring back leadership a really high score, it's going to make them feel good, but then they're going to realize we're not getting our work done. So what good is this measure? So you've got to have a good high bar metric, and many organizations do. And a high bar metric will actually predict performance, and that's what organizations want. So right now in the U.S., about 30% of people, or a little over 30% of people are engaged. That's kind of been leveling off lately. It peaked at 36. Globally, it's about 20%. We'll be releasing our State of the Global Workplace report in a couple of weeks. So I'm giving you a little bit of a precursor to that. But the measurement part is one piece of it, but the rest of it is all about, what you do to build a culture and how you upskill managers so that they can, and select the right managers, as I was saying earlier, so that they can kind of blend together engagement and performance management in an effective way. And a lot of this is low-hanging fruit that just doesn't get systematized in organizations.
So, Jim, how do you respond to the skeptic who says engaged employees are simply more compliant? They're better at doing what they're told rather than genuinely more productive or innovative.
If you define it that way, like I said, a lot of measures out there are more like a measure of contentment. The way that we look at engagement is based on more hardcore work-related concepts. Do you know what your role is? Do you have goals that you set? If you're doing performance management right, it should be consistent with engagement. It should be about role clarity. It should be about continuous conversations with people about their work and their work-life situation. And it should be about accountability. High engagement is about accountability. It's holding people accountable. High performers want to be held accountable. They want to know how well they're doing. And sadly, that's kind of missing right now in organizations. There's not real good accountability around performance. But that starts with good measurement. So you've got to measure engagement alongside performance and study it together.
It also requires some very candid, open conversations with people. A lot of managers are uncomfortable with that.
It's interesting. I was watching an interview with one of my favorite former coaches, Mike Krzyzewski, and he was talking about how he has very candid conversations with some of his top players, how he used to pretty strong halftime talks with people. But he said, you can only do that if you first build trust. And so the best managers build trust, and then they can have a candid conversation and it'll get absorbed the right way. And they'll go out in the second half and tear it apart. They'll become kind of a different player instantly. And it's the same thing in organizations. If as a manager, you build trust by listening to people, most people come to work wanting to make a difference. And so when you listen to people and build trust, you can have the kinds of conversations you're talking about, Rodger, and people will accept it and they'll know that you're looking out for their best interest.
Right. Well, speaking of managers, Gallup has long emphasized that the manager accounts for a disproportionate share of the variance in team engagement. How large is that effect? And why do so many organizations still seem to underinvest in manager development?
Yeah. So if I'm really conservative, 70% of the variance in team engagement comes back to what managers do. It's not that the individual doesn't have a role. Individuals have a role too. They need to be initiating when they see problems. They need to be initiating if their goals aren't clear. And I think we need more of that nowadays because people are separated more than they used to be after the pandemic and all the remote work. But I think the problem that organizations face is they treat management and engagement as more episodic than continuous. And when we build systems that are episodic, like employee surveys, and we don't treat management as a continuous activity where I'm checking in with people at least once a week and having meaningful conversations with them once a week, then you've got a continuous flow of information and you can help people make better decisions. You can help them reset their goals. So I think the best organizations they build processes where managers see their jobs in coaching people as more continuous than a series of episodes like a 6-month performance review.
Right. I mean, if you wait until Bob hasn't been performing, I can't wait until I talk with him at his quarterly review 3 months from now. I mean, that doesn't work. Unfortunately, it seems that some managers seem to have that mindset.
Well, they're taught that. We've had systems of those quarterly or semi-annual reviews around performance management for a long time, and it hasn't worked. Because as you said, Rodger, you get to that point and the individual is thinking, well, why didn't you tell me this, several months ago?
Right.
If you're telling me I'm not performing well or if I should have done something different, that could happen in the moment, right? It could happen if you're having a weekly conversation with somebody. And it doesn't have to be a long conversation if it's continuous because one conversation builds on the next, right? And I'm not saying the slow down conversations aren't important. I think they're important for development. I think it's important to have a slow down conversation periodically where you're really thinking about their future. You're thinking about what they've done in the past and how that relates to the future and helping them plan their future in the organization. I think that's important, but it doesn't replace the continuous conversations that have to be happening to make this work. And it's even more important now than it's ever been because we have so much more hybrid work than we did in the past.
Yeah. What you're saying reminds me of a conversation I had with Doug Conant, who, as you may know, was CEO at Nabisco and then president of Campbell Soup and then chairman of Avon, clearly a Hall of Famer in the business world. But he was fired from his first job. He showed up at work one day and his manager just fired him. And he apparently was fired for some blind spots he had that could have been dealt with if they had had that conversation. Mm-hmm. So that organization lost Doug Conant, who turned out to be a superstar, just because the manager didn't have that conversation.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with Doug. He's referenced our work quite a bit. That's a great example of how that actually has played out.
So many organizations promote people into management because they were great individual contributors. That seems to be a pattern and has as long as I can remember.
And it seems right on the surface.
Yeah, it does. Right. So what does your research say about how often that strategy backfires?
Too often. It might work out. And by the way, I think, when managers have some of that individual contributor experience, it helps them manage with higher credibility because people know they've been there, right? But not everybody, I would say, again, if I'm really conservative, I'd say maybe 30% of the time an organization might get it right. It's probably less than that, actually. And what I mean by getting it right is picking somebody who actually gets a kick out of managing a group of people and doesn't see it as a kind of horrifying nightmare of so many individual idiosyncrasies that they have to manage. There are people that love the differences in others and love coaching toward those differences. And there's others that once they get into the job, they learn that it's not fun.
Right.
And so it's not good for them. It's not good for the people they're managing.
Well, I've actually seen managers who request going back as an individual contributor.
And that's smart.
They just realize this isn't the place for me. I can make a better contribution as an individual contributor.
Well, and organizations can build equity around star individual contributors.
Well, sure.
In many cases, they might make more money than the manager because of the value they bring. So part of it is cultural and what you're rewarding and giving people the experience of managing maybe in some ways before they even get into the job so they know what they're getting into.
Test drive it a little bit.
Yeah. I think that's one way of doing it. There's also formal selection procedures we've developed over time that get at some of the traits that make people better, like, how well they can motivate others, to what extent they can get people to do tough things when the organization needs them to and make them feel good about it.
Sure.
Their ability to individualize effectively and manage toward those individual idiosyncrasies I was talking about earlier. Their ability to hold people accountable and make decisions and all those kinds of things go into effective management.
Well, as you know better than most, many things have changed since COVID. So let me ask, remote and hybrid work seem to have strained the manager-employee relationship in many instances. What specific behaviors do great remote managers seem to exhibit that average ones don't?
To your point, we're seeing in the data there's more distance psychologically between employees and employers because there's not enough planning around. If you can do in-person time, it should be planned so that people are together at the same time. It's hard to replace in-person time. So I think, one thing is that if there can be in-person time besides these episodic videos that we tend to do with meetings,
right,
that's important. But I think the most important thing that a remote manager does is they plan for at least at minimum weekly connections with people that are meaningful. And I'm not talking about just, hi, how are you doing? See you later.
Right.
It's more, let's talk about the work that you're doing, who you're doing it with. I heard from Larry that you did really good work on this project. We recognize him for it. So recognition should happen. And you hear that from when you're talking to the whole team, you're hearing that secondhand. That's some of the best recognition people can get. But the point is, you're talking about the work-life continuum. You're talking about mostly goals, recognizing them, thinking about their strengths individually and how those strengths can be utilized better, who they collaborate with best. Those are the kinds of contextual things that should happen. But you've got to have a habit
sure,
of at least a weekly conversation. If physical distance, for whatever unintended reason, tends to cause psychological distance if you just leave it to its own accord.
Well, yeah, and specificity is important. Just telling somebody they're doing a good job is not nearly as helpful as saying, you did a good job on this project. Let me tell you about 3 things I noticed about what you did as you interacted with that client or that customer. And I think you were really on target there. We need to see more of that. That kind of feedback is much more helpful than you did a good job.
That's an excellent point. Yeah, and you've got to know what the person's doing. You got to know their colleagues. You've got to kind of be in the middle of what they're doing to be able to provide that kind of feedback.
Right.
And then do a lot of listening. That's, I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. The biggest one is just listening. A lot of people get into the job of managing and they think the job is all delegation.
Right.
The biggest job of managing is listening to the people who are closest to the customer.
Right. So let's shift gears here a little bit. Since COVID, and prior to COVID, we were talking about burnout, but since COVID, we really seem to be talking about it a lot. How does Gallup define burnout, and in what ways does that definition differ from how most organizations use the word?
Well, let me start with the World Health Organization, which officially labeled burnout as a work-related syndrome. And when they talk about it or define it, they talk about concepts like depletion, exhaustion, mental distance from your job, cynicism, reduced professional efficacy, which is basically means you're not doing what you do best. And the way that I would think about it, I don't think those are the wrong terms at all. I think that those are some of the outcomes of burnout. But when I try to think about it, I think about how it has something in common with actually what you want in a flow state. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi did a lot of writing on flow. I knew him really well. He defined flow as a high challenge state where people don't have barriers to them getting their work done, and their work can be done in time pass quickly because they're so absorbed in their work. Burnout has one condition very similar to flow, and that's high challenge. You're in a high challenge state, but you've got barriers to getting your work done. It could be that your manager isn't helping you or supporting you. It could be that you don't have the materials and equipment you need to do your work right, and so you're frustrated from that. It could be that your goals are unclear, and that's happening a lot now with this physical distance.
Sure.
Role clarity and goals being clear. that frustrates people because most people, they want to do good work. And when you don't have the support, it causes burnout. People would think on the surface, I think they would think that it's about being overworked in terms of hours. That could play into it, but generally it's more about the quality of the work and whether you have the kind of support that you need so you can get into more of a flow state and do what you do best on a regular basis.
So much of this seems to go back to the need for having really focused, pertinent conversations.
Yeah.
We make so many assumptions. Well, Jim, how do you distinguish between an employee who is burned out and one who is simply disengaged? Are they the same thing, different degrees of the same thing, or genuinely distinct conditions?
They are related, but one difference I would point to is that you could be in a job where you don't feel challenged at all and be disengaged. I think in a burnout situation, you do have challenge, which we want, but you've got barriers. So that'd be one distinction I would make. Burnout is frustration because you're trying to do something that you just can't do. You're not equipped. You could be even in a job that doesn't fit your talents, and that could cause burnout. So you're continuously over and over again trying to do something you don't do well. So that could cause it. So they are related, but that's where I'd draw the line in terms of the difference. You could be in a boring job with low challenge and be disengaged, where that may not necessarily be burnout. It might be just disinterest.
Just earning a paycheck.
Yeah. Going through the motions.
Right.
Your change initiative has the budget. The strategy looks solid, and everyone's nodding along in the meetings. But for some reason, it's going nowhere. Dr. Rodger Dean Duncan knows why. After 40 years in the trenches with top business leaders, he knows that change fails when organizations lack the right foundations: trust, accountability, and real communication. Dr. Duncan's free 10-minute assessment shows you exactly where your organization stands. Answer a few straightforward questions that reveal your true change readiness level. Don't waste months discovering the hard way. Get your free assessment today at leadershop.net/change. Again, that's leadershop.net/change.
Well, you've studied recovery from burnout. How long does recovery actually take, and what conditions are necessary for genuine recovery versus superficial symptom management?
Well, I think it can happen pretty quickly, actually, but it starts with understanding what the barriers are and fixing some of those. The quickest fix I've seen is a different manager in some cases.
Yeah.
But that can just flip things completely around. If you have a manager that doesn't listen to you very much and just tells you what to do, and you flip to a manager who actually starts listening to your situation and knows how you work effectively. We're studying the science behind culture shock. We found there were two categories of people if you just kind of lump things, which I like to do. And there's those who we call splitters. They like to split their work and life. And there are blenders, people who like to blend work and life. That's their preference. Sometimes those things change as we go through our life stages. Mm-hmm. But if a manager doesn't know that preference, they could easily burn someone out. So let's say that someone's burnt out because they've got a manager who's contacting them on weekends. Let's say their preference is to split work and life, which is fine. Both of them can be productive. And you've got a manager who isn't aware of that, and they're bugging the heck out of you on the weekend or in evenings to get a project done when you're going to get it done anyway, but you've got it blocked out in terms of your work schedule, your work time. Or if you're a blender and, your manager doesn't know that, and let's say you're taking care of, this is particularly relevant to women at work because they tend to be not all the time, but they tend on average to be the caregivers for kids and tend to take on that responsibility. If they need to go take care of something.
Right.
And a manager says, well, why aren't you in the office from 8 to 5? But they're still working the same amount of time. They're just doing it in a way that works for their life.
Right.
That can cause burnout. So, and women actually do report higher burnout, even though they're more highly engaged. So that's another kind of difference. They can be engaged, but still report higher burnout. Those are the kinds of things that cause it, though. And so a manager who understands that can change the symptom of burnout pretty quickly if they just build in some flexibility.
Well, speaking of demographics, younger workers appear to have a fundamentally different relationship with work than previous generations. Is that a values shift, a response to economic conditions, or something else entirely?
Well, I think of generations as being a combination of your life stage, the cultural aspects that are around you during that life stage. So now we've got a younger group of people who have grown up with iPhones. They've grown up with instant communication. Many of them know they can do a lot remotely through their phones and through video and all the different technology that we have nowadays. But I think they still need, we're seeing they're dropping in terms of their reported development and ability to learn and grow at work, whereas it used to be an advantage for younger people. And I think this separation we have now, due in part to remote work and us not handling it the right way, in many cases, young people just need some strong advice on your career is going to build. If you get into the office a few days a week and plan it appropriately, if you're within commuting distance, I'm not saying fully remote work can't work either, but if you can have in-person time, your development opportunities are going to increase. And I think some people need to be told that. So I think it's younger people are trending down on engagement in a lot of different ways. And I think you can't divorce the remote work from that. But it's interestingly, Gen Z employees are telling us they prefer some time in the office. They want to be with their coworkers. The problem is organizations aren't putting the planning in place so that when they do show up, their coworkers are there with them and their managers there with them and they get some development. It's a simple low-hanging fruit kind of thing, again, where organizations need to be better organized in terms of when people are together. And I think that in-person time is a factor. You don't take the human being out of us just because we, have technology.
Right. Well, of course, there's a growing number of schools now, school districts, that have the students check their phones at the door when they come into a classroom, knowing that if they don't, they're certainly not going to be engaged in the classwork. And I know of business organizations that ask people, if they don't ask them just to turn their phone off, to check them at the door. Now, it's sad that needs to happen, but I mean, that's kind of where we are with, you talk about remote work. I mean, there are a lot of people who are remote at the family dinner table.
That's a great point. And I think, it's going to vary a bit by person, but if you do notice that it's causing, people not to be engaged or not to be directly connecting with the task at hand, then yeah, I think that's, we have technology brings us a lot of advantages.
Sure.
The first thing I said when COVID hit and we had all this technology and video conference ability, thank God for technology, because we could have a seamless transition. If you already know your team,
right,
the transition was seamless. If you're a new employee, it's not so seamless.
Exactly.
You've got some work to do to be very intentional about building relationships. So I think that the people in the office thing, I think is just, and I'm not saying it has to be every day, but there needs to be a formula that's right for each organization and it's important for the older people to be there too, because they can provide some of that institutional knowledge and mentoring that goes with it. When you can make it happen, certainly, and we wrote about this in Culture Shock also and reviewed a lot of the research on it, but in-person time is really hard to replicate. I think there's people that work remotely that do a fascinating job, but they're very intentional about connecting with people.
So let's talk about AI for a minute. Gallup has been studying the human side of work for decades. As AI reshapes job descriptions, what does your research say about how workers are actually feeling about that transition?
Well, I was surprised in our initial trending at how few people felt fear of losing their job due to technology and AI. We started training it back in 23, and it was like 15%, stayed around 15%. And now just this past quarter one of 26, it jumped up to 18%. So that's a pretty big jump, a 3-point jump. And so I think we're starting to reach an inflection point. And I should also add, employees who are in organizations that are pretty actively using AI, their fear of losing their job is 23% of them said they had some fear about losing their job. Some of that could be the stuff in the media about, there are companies that are slashing, 40, 50% of their employees. That's not the norm, but that's what's happening in some organizations. So it is starting to hit home, I guess is my point. And use of AI has gone up. We've been training use of AI. That's been going up pretty rapidly at a more rapid pace among leaders and managers, but also individual contributors. And so the use has gone up significantly over time. And we've got actually a couple of articles coming out on Gallup.com on that topic.
Yeah. If
people want to take a look at that probably by the time this episode is aired, they'll already be out there in the next few weeks. But we're trending that a lot. I think what AI is doing is it's causing kind of a reshuffling. While some organizations are cutting, others are adding. And so it's kind of reshuffling the type of work that's being done and the types of jobs. In most jobs, I would argue AI can be an efficient companion. And I think if we think about it that way, for most of our jobs, it's going to help us in a lot of different ways.
So engagement has always been about the relationship between people and their work. How does that relationship change when a significant portion of the work is being done by AI? What effect does that have?
I think what it does, from everything I've looked at, Rodger, is it changes how we approach the fundamental elements of engagement. So the elements themselves are still important, right? We still need to know what's expected. We still need to have tools to do our work, which AI is one of those now. That's helped us a lot if we use it the right way. We're still going to need to be recognized when we do good work. We're still going to need development opportunities. How that happens could change through AI. So if you imagine into the near future, a manager might have an AI companion that helps them set up for the next meeting by helping them think about the engagement level of the team that they're managing, thinking about their own strengths, the strengths of the people that they're managing, the goals that they've talked about previously. It could be a very efficient companion for a manager to engage their team more quickly than having a report and sitting down with them and listening to people talk about different elements of engagement where some people, may not say anything. AI could give them a good head start. We're working on some tools like that. That person I was working with, we're just experimenting with an AI kind of adaptive tool for surveying and giving managers quick feedback. And he said, I just gained more insight through this report than sitting down. Not that you shouldn't still sit down and go through it with the team, but it could give you insights that give you a huge head start when you do talk with your team about what they're thinking about. So I think the efficiencies and the companion side of AI is pretty exciting.
Well, now your book, Culture Shock, suggests that organizational culture is under siege. Leaders love to talk about culture, it seems, but your research suggests that most of them don't actually know the state of their own culture. Why is that self-knowledge so rare?
I think it comes back to some of the things we were talking about earlier, where they'll get a report that says their culture is doing okay when it's actually not. And they'll see that work isn't getting done appropriately. But I think culture doesn't happen because a leader makes a big statement. Not that leaders shouldn't make statements and they should communicate through a lot of different means and mechanisms. But culture happens when you have a critical mass of managers who know what the organization is trying to get done, and they translate that to their employees effectively. Culture, I guess you could define as how we do things around here, but you got to know what you want your culture to be and what your values are, what your boundaries are as an organization. But part of culture is got to be about getting work done. Engagement is the work-related part of culture.
And it always seems to go back to the need for explicit conversations.
Yeah, it really does. And that really can only happen in a consistent way if you've got managers who are equipped to do that with their teams.
So, Jim, what's the relationship between psychological safety and engagement? And can you have one without the other?
I would say that psychological safety is a subcomponent of engagement. It doesn't explain all of engagement. I think people need to feel safe enough to voice their opinions, to be themselves, their professional selves. People a lot of times talk about, well, you should just be able to come to work and be your entire self at work. Well, I'd add, you need to be a professional too.
Sure.
I mean, there's a lot of things people would do when they're if they bring their whole self to work, they would offend someone else, right? So we know that with all the politics going on right now.
It would be fine if they left some of that stuff at home.
Yeah. Let's all be professionals, but you can still be yourself and voice your opinion, and you can be yourself through your strengths, right? And so I think that's part of psychological safety, and it's part of engagement, but engagement is bigger than that. Engagement is about knowing your role, and engagement is about being rewarded for doing great work. Engagement is about your work connecting to a bigger purpose that the organization is about, and seeing how your work actually influences your customers, however you define that, influences people in the real world. So I guess my answer is it's inside of engagement, but it's not all of engagement.
Well, Jim, after a career studying human engagement at work, what worries you most about the direction organizations are heading, and what gives you genuine hope?
What worries me most is there aren't enough organizations quickly. Well, let me start with this. There's a trend right now toward flattening in organizations, and we see that in our data. You can flatten organizations, have larger spans of control, but if you don't do it with the right conditions, like the ones we've been talking about, it's going to lead to failure. And so while organizations that want to do more flattening, get rid of middle managers and expand the span of each manager, if you just do that structurally and you don't put the right conditions in place, like engaging your team makes a difference. Knowing how much individual contributor work each manager does and how many people they can actually manage relative to that. The big one we've been talking about is having the habit of weekly conversations with people. Let's say you expand your span of control from 10 people to 20, and you can have good conversation with each person each week. It's probably 15 to 30 minutes. So that's 10 hours of your week if you got 20 people. It's very doable.
Sure.
But you've got to have the habit of doing it, right? So you've got to have the conditions in place. If you have talented managers, they can manage more people also. So if you ignore those conditions and you just expand the span, you're setting yourself up for failure. The other concern I have is the psychological distance that we've got to solve for, but that can be solved for in the same ways we've been talking about. What gives me hope is that I've been able to work with a lot of organizations over the years that they get it right. And so while the norm in the world might be about 20% engaged employees, there's a number of organizations that we recognize every year that are at 70% plus, and they didn't start there.
Right.
So they did it in a lot of the same ways we've been talking about it. They've got, engagement as part of their performance management. It's part of their strategy as an organization. It's not just a once a year survey thing. It's part of how they go about training their managers. Performance management and engagement are kind of one and the same.
And these behaviors are deliberate.
Very deliberate. It doesn't happen by chance. These organizations don't get to 70 by chance. They get there because they intentionally say, this is the kind of culture we want. This is why. And the big why is performance. I haven't talked to any leader who doesn't want to increase the number of customers they have, or that doesn't want a more profitable, efficient business being run. And some of the moves that are being made right now are structural moves, like the flattening thing, that aren't taking into account the conditions you need to put in place to get it right.
Right.
But the hope is we know how organizations can get it right, because we've seen it happen. And it's really cool to see it happen. So I think we can get there, but we've got to go back to that original thing you asked about, Rodger, that might be counterintuitive, or maybe it's just a complete miss. And that's how you get people into the role of manager. And not enough organizations are paying serious attention to that.
Right. Well, Dr. Jim Harter, thank you so much for joining us on Leadership. This conversation has been exactly what I hoped it would be: rigorous, honest, and immediately useful. What strikes me most, reflecting on everything Jim has shared, is that the engagement challenge is not a mystery. Gallup has documented what works. The data is clear. The practices are known. And yet the gap between what we know and what most organizations actually do remains stubbornly wide. That gap is not an information problem. It's a will problem, a commitment problem, and ultimately a leadership problem, which means it is solvable. And leaders who take seriously what Jim has shared with us are already better positioned to close it. Jim's book is Culture Shock. The research is at Gallup.com. And the opportunity, as Jim has made clear, is hiding in plain sight, in the daily conversations, the manager behaviors, and the cultural choices that either build engagement or quietly erode it. Be sure to leave a review of our podcast. Even a single sentence fuels the algorithms that promote the great content that the Leadership Podcast provides. And for free resources to help you in your leadership journey, go to leadership.net. That's leadership.net. Thanks again for joining us. Until next time, stay safe, be happy, and spread good cheer wherever you go. For Leadership, I'm Rodger Dean Duncan.